What if I told you that right now, as you're sitting in your house, shivering and watching your heating bill climb higher every single month, there is a window in your home that could be doing all of that work for free? Not someday, not after a $10,000 renovation. Right now, this winter, for about $30 and one Saturday afternoon. Sounds impossible, right? That's exactly what they want you to think. Here's what nobody in the heating industry will ever say out loud. A properly treated south-facing window doesn't just slow down heat loss. It actively generates heat. It collects solar energy, stores it inside your walls, and releases it slowly through the night, like a furnace that runs on nothing but sunlight, and a technique that's been quietly buried for over 4 decades. The people who kept this secret alive the longest weren't scientists or engineers. They were Amish farmers in rural Pennsylvania and Ohio, people who had no gas bill to pay, no utility company knocking on their door, and absolutely no reason to forget what works. I want you to imagine this. It's a February afternoon in Holmes County, Ohio. The temperature outside is barely breaking 12 degrees. Wind is cutting across frozen fields. You walk into a farmhouse kitchen expecting to feel the familiar bite of cold near the windows. Instead, the room is warm, not just tolerable, genuinely, comfortably warm. A woman is rolling out pie, dough in short sleeves. There's no furnace hum, no baseboard heater clicking away, just a south-facing window glowing softly in the afternoon light, quietly doing what the gas company has been charging you for every winter of your life. That farmhouse changed everything for the man who first walked into it. He was a heating and cooling contractor with over 3 decades of experience installing furnaces and heat pumps across eastern Pennsylvania. He had been trained the way every contractor in America is trained to tell homeowners one thing: windows are the enemy. Windows are where your heat escapes. Seal them, upgrade them, replace them. Spend $600 per opening on double pane replacements. Spend $40 on weather stripping kits. Keep feeding the machine. And he believed it. Until the day a farmer named Jonas pointed at a south-facing window and told him in plain terms that it was the room's primary heat source from sunrise until nearly 4 in the afternoon. He spent 20 minutes looking for the radiator before he finally understood. The window was the radiator. This is the knowledge that the modern energy industry has spent 40 years making sure you never stumble across. And today, right here, Secret Vault is handing it back to you exactly the way it was handed back to that contractor on Jonas's front porch. Piece by piece, layer by layer, with nothing held back. Let's start with what's actually happening when sunlight hits a window, because this isn't magic. This is physics that the United States Department of Energy documented thoroughly back in 1976, during the energy crisis, when the government briefly became very interested in helping Americans heat their homes without paying for it. The principle is called passive solar gain. A south-facing window, during winter months, receives sunlight at a low angle, exactly the angle that allows it to penetrate deep into a room rather than bouncing off the glass. That light carries energy, heat energy. And if you know how to capture it, store it, and prevent it from escaping overnight, a single standard 3x5 foot window can deliver the equivalent of running a 1,500-watt space heater for 3 hours. Every clear day, all winter long, completely free. The Brookhaven National Laboratory ran the numbers on this during the energy crisis and found that a properly treated south-facing window can produce over 1,000 British thermal units of net heat gain per square foot per day. That is not a theoretical estimate. That is real-world measured data from a federal testing program that was later quietly defunded, stripped from public circulation, and allowed to disappear. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Picture this for a second. There is an entire industry, actually several industries, stacked on top of each other, that depends entirely on you believing your window is a problem. The natural gas industry alone pulls in over $200 billion a year from American homeowners. Add the electric heating market, the replacement window industry, the insulation contractors, the weatherproofing product lines, and you are looking at well over $300 billion per year built on one simple assumption, that you do not know what you're looking at when you look at a south-facing window in January. The moment you understand what that window can actually do, the whole machine breaks down. You stop calling the furnace company. You stop buying replacement windows. You stop paying the monthly bill. And that is a scenario worth hundreds of billions of dollars to the people who benefit from your ignorance. In 1979, the Department of Energy published something called the Residential Passive Solar Retrofit Handbook. It was distributed through agricultural extension offices, Penn State, Ohio State, and it made its way into rural farming communities across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. For a brief window of time, ordinary American homeowners had access to step-by-step instructions for turning their existing windows into heat-collecting systems at almost no cost. By 1983, the handbook was out of print. The funding was cut. The researchers were reassigned. The knowledge quietly vanished from the mainstream, except in the communities that had no incentive to forget it. The Amish kept it because they were never plugged into the system in the first place. No gas bill to pay, no furnace salesman at the door, no utility company sending mailers about energy efficiency programs that, not coincidentally, always seem to require purchasing something. They simply practiced what they'd learned, refined it across generations, and passed it down as common sense rather than science, even though the science is ironclad. A bishop in Lancaster County once mentioned that his grandfather had a similar pamphlet from 1941, put out by the Department of Agriculture during wartime fuel rationing, describing almost the same technique. This knowledge has been suppressed twice in the last century. Once when cheap natural gas made it irrelevant to everyone except people who weren't buying natural gas. And once again in the early 80s, when the energy crisis ended, the political will to teach Americans self-sufficiency evaporated overnight, and the Amish were left as the sole librarians of a knowledge the rest of the country threw away. Here is what they kept. Here is what actually works. The system has 4 layers. Each one costs almost nothing. Together, they transform an ordinary window into something that generates, stores, and holds heat through the coldest nights of the year. The first layer is what determines whether your window is a heat trap or a heat leak, and it is the one most people would never think of on their own. It's called a thermal mass surface. In every Amish farmhouse that uses this system, there's a dark-colored surface positioned directly behind the south-facing window on the interior wall. Sometimes a piece of flat black painted board, sometimes a slab of slate, sometimes a section of dark brick. The purpose is straightforward and elegant. Sunlight comes through the glass and strikes this dark surface. Instead of bouncing off and being lost, the energy is absorbed. The mass heats up slowly throughout the day, storing that thermal energy the way a battery stores electricity. Then, after the sun goes down and the outside temperature drops, the mass begins releasing that stored heat back into the room, slowly, evenly, for the next 4 to 6 hours. This is the same principle behind what engineers call a trombe wall, a design patented by French engineer Félix Trombe in 1967. What's remarkable, and what the industry prefers you not think about, is that Amish farmers in rural Ohio were doing a simplified, fully functional version of this more than 100 years before that patent was ever filed. They didn't name it, they didn't publish papers about it, they just did it because it worked. Here's what it looks like in practice. A piece of barnwood painted flat black, about the same width as the window, leaning against the interior wall directly across from the southern exposure. The flat finish matters. Gloss paint reflects sunlight back out through the glass. Flat black absorbs it. A quart of flat black exterior paint costs about $12 at any hardware store. If you need the board itself, a half-inch sheet of plywood from any lumberyard gives you enough material to cover 2 large windows for around $18. According to research conducted by the University of Minnesota's Center for Sustainable Building Research between 2012 and 2014, this single modification alone, just placing a dark painted board behind a south-facing window, increases daytime heat gain in that room by between 30 and 40%. You will not find that statistic in any mainstream renovation guide. The second layer sits inside the window itself. The Amish version is beautifully simple. A sheet of clear plastic film stretched across the inside of the window frame, creating a still air gap of about 3/4 of an inch between the film and the glass. That trapped air is the insulation. It cuts nighttime heat loss through the window by roughly 50%, while doing nothing to reduce daytime solar gain. Modern hardware stores sell a complete kit, double-sided tape, the film itself, instructions, for about $8 per window. You apply it with the tape, run a hairdryer over it to shrink it taut and invisible, and it lasts the entire heating season. What this $8 kit actually does, in terms of thermal performance, is transform a single-pane window into something approaching the performance of a double-pane unit, which the replacement window industry will cheerfully sell you for $600 per opening. Read that again. $8 versus $600. Same functional result. The only difference is which option makes someone else rich. The third layer is the one that turns this from a passive conservation trick into an active heating system. It's called a night insulation panel, and in the Amish homes where this technique has been refined across generations, it's almost always a piece of rigid foam board cut to fit snugly inside the window frame, with one side covered in a thin layer of fabric for aesthetics, and the silver foil side facing the glass. Every evening at sundown, the panel goes in, every morning it comes out. That's the entire operation. The foam board you want, silver-faced polyisocyanurate, 1 inch thick, runs about $15 for a 4x8 sheet at any home improvement store, which is enough material to cover 2 large windows or 4 small ones. Once in place at night, the panel adds roughly an R6 insulation value to your window opening, tripling the thermal resistance of a standard double-pane window for the 8 to 12 hours per day when sunlight isn't available and the window is doing nothing but losing heat. The Amish use heavier wooden versions stuffed with batting that last for decades. The foam version achieves nearly the same result for under $4 per opening. Now here is where it goes from impressive to genuinely extraordinary. Picture this. You walk into an Amish kitchen on a January morning in Lancaster County. Along the base of the south wall, in front of the window, there are several dark-colored containers, old stoneware crocks, painted glass jugs, a repurposed metal milk can, all of them matte black. They sit quietly. They make no sound. They burn nothing. But throughout the day, as sunlight pours through the window and the thermal mass board absorbs the high-frequency visible light, those containers are absorbing something else, the infrared radiation that the mass itself begins radiating as it heats up. The water inside each container has a heat capacity nearly 5 times higher than wood or brick. A single 5-gallon container of water painted black, sitting in direct sunlight behind a south-facing window, absorbs roughly 8,000 British thermal units of heat over the course of one clear winter day. That's the equivalent of running a small electric space heater for nearly 2 hours, stored silently in a jug of water that cost you nothing. Through the evening, as the room cools, those containers release their stored heat slowly back into the air, holding the room temperature steady from sundown until close to midnight. 3 or 4 containers spread across the floor in front of your sunniest south-facing window will dramatically reduce the number of hours your furnace has to run, not by slowing heat loss, but by actively supplying replacement heat from stored solar energy. A woman in Holmes County named Sarah told the contractor who visited Jonas's farm that her family had been keeping painted glass jugs in front of their kitchen window for 4 generations. Her grandmother called them the silent stove. They never made a sound. They never burned a stick of wood. They just sat there and gave back what the sun had given them. But there's a 5th element, the one buried deepest, the one that traces back to a federal document that almost no one alive today has read. And it is the single modification that produces the highest measured return on investment of anything tested in the original Department of Energy field study. In 1979, a researcher named Dr. Edward Mazria led a federally funded field study on passive solar retrofits in cold climate single-family homes. The study was distributed through cooperative extension services in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, and it eventually found its way into Amish hands, which is notably the only reason anyone kept practicing what it described after the program was defunded in 1983. Inside that document was a finding that almost nobody outside those farming communities ever applied. Mazria's team discovered that the single most effective addition to a passive solar window system was something they called a reflective ground apron. Here's what it is. A strip of light-colored material, white-painted plywood, canvas, even a layer of clean white gravel, laid on the ground directly outside the south. A facing window extending about 6 feet from the base of the wall. In winter, you put it in place. In summer, you remove it. It costs under $15 and takes 10 minutes to install. What it does is bounce additional sunlight up through the window at a steep, upward angle that the thermal mass inside the room absorbs even more efficiently than direct overhead sunlight. According to Mazria's own data, this single element, a piece of white plywood lying on the ground, increases total measurable heat gain through the window by between 18 and 26% above and beyond the gain from all the interior treatments combined. 18 to 26% more heat from a piece of painted plywood on the ground. That finding has been sitting in a federal archive for over 45 years. It was never reissued. The program that produced it was never reinstated. A retired engineer who worked on the original study, reached by phone decades later, said he hadn't heard anyone mention the ground apron technique in 30 years. The Amish never stopped using it. In every farmhouse visited where the south side faced an open field, there was either a strip of white gravel or a removable white painted board lying on the ground below the kitchen window. They didn't call it a reflective ground apron. They called it the snowboard because it mimics what fresh snow does naturally, bounces low-angle winter sunlight up through the glass at exactly the most productive angle. When snow falls, it does the job automatically. When there's no snow, the board does the same job, which is part of the reason why south-facing Amish kitchens in northern states stay so warm through February, the season when most American homeowners are watching their heating bills peak. Let's put the whole system together because understanding each piece individually doesn't capture what happens when they all work in concert. Imagine this full cycle. Morning. You pull the night insulation panel out of the window frame. Sunlight begins entering at a low winter angle, amplified by the white reflective board on the ground outside. The clear film and air gaps slow any thermal loss while allowing nearly full light transmission. The dark painted board on the interior wall begins absorbing visible light and converting it to stored heat. The painted water containers on the floor begin absorbing the infrared radiation that the mass board radiates as it warms. By early afternoon, the room is several degrees warmer than it was at sunrise, without the furnace running a single cycle. By late afternoon, The mass and the water containers are fully charged with stored heat. At sundown, you slide the foam night panel into the window frame. The room is now sealed. The panel adds R6 to the opening that was previously your home's single greatest point of heat loss. Through the evening, the dark mass board and the silent water containers slowly release their stored energy back into the room. By midnight, the room temperature has barely dropped. By morning, the cycle begins again. No electricity, no natural gas, no monthly bill, no contractor, no permit, no phone call to the utility company. Just sunlight. The same sunlight that has been falling on the south wall of your house every clear day for every year you have lived there, finally being put to work instead of wasted. A heating contractor who applied the system to his own 1968 ranch home in eastern Pennsylvania, original aluminum frame windows, nothing special, cut his annual heating bill from $2,300 to under $900. Over $1,400 a year in savings from a one-time investment of less than $400 across 13 windows. He made the entire investment back within the first 90 days of the first winter. Every winter since has been pure savings. Total cost for the complete 4-element system on a single window, between $35 and $45, depending on local hardware store pricing. Annual heating savings for a typical 3-bedroom home in a northern climate, between $1,100 and $1,700. Lifetime savings over 20 years, somewhere between $22,000 and $34,000, from knowledge that was buried twice in the last century. Suppressed once during the post-war era when cheap natural gas made self-sufficiency inconvenient for the companies selling it, and suppressed again in the early 80s when the energy crisis ended and the political will to teach Americans how to heat their homes for free disappeared overnight. What was left was a $300 billion a year industry built on the assumption that you would never find this out. Here at Secret Vault, the whole point is exactly this: pulling buried knowledge back into the light and putting it in the hands of the people it was always meant to serve. This technique was never lost. It was never secret in any mysterious sense. It was sitting in federal archives and old agricultural extension bulletins, and in the unwritten daily practice of farming families who simply never had any reason to forget what worked. The knowledge didn't disappear from the world. It disappeared from your world. And there is a meaningful difference. Every south-facing window in your house right now is either an asset being activated or a $500 a year liability being ignored. There is no middle ground. Physics doesn't care what your contractor told you. It doesn't care what your utility company wants you to believe. It doesn't care about the $300 billion industry that depends on you staring at that window and seeing a problem instead of a paycheck. Here is what you do tomorrow. Find the sunniest south-facing window in your house. Measure the frame. Write down these 4 items. A piece of scrap wood or half-inch plywood to paint flat black. A clear plastic window film kit, a sheet of foil-faced foam board, and either a few used 5-gallon water jugs or whatever dark containers you can find for free. Drive to the hardware store. Spend $30 to $45. Come home. Spend a Saturday. Then, on the first clear morning after you finish, before you do anything else, put your hand on the dark painted board behind that window and hold it there. It will be warm. The room will be warm. The furnace will not be running. And in that moment, you will understand something that Jonas understood, that Sarah's grandmother understood, that Amish families across Pennsylvania and Ohio have understood for generations, that something real and valuable was quietly taken from you, not through any dramatic conspiracy, but through the slow, steady pressure of profit protecting itself from knowledge. And you will also understand that you just took it back. The sun was always going to fall on that window, every single day, every winter of your life. The only question was whether you were going to let it work for you or keep paying someone else to do a job that the sun was always willing to do for free. Now you know the answer. And now there's nothing left to do except go build it.